Thank you for joining us in the community planning conversation today. Don Keefer from the Illinois State Geological Survey is my guest, and we are going to be talking about the importance of remembering what's under the surface of the pavement and the concrete and being concerned about water supply, hydrology, what are in the subsurfaces when we are making our decisions about planning. We often forget about that because these are unseen aspects of our community and our subsurface soils. Don, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
For our viewers who maybe don't know much about the Illinois State Geological Survey, why don't you just briefly
Sure.
describe it and explain why you're here on campus and what's the connection to the university?
Sure. The Illinois State Geological Survey just finished its centennial celebration last year, so we've been around for quite a while, 100, going on 101 years. We've got approximately 160, 180 scientists working for the State Geological Survey. Most of them are based on campus here. We occupy a little over half of the Natural Resources building, which is across the street from the Education College, kitty corner from the Art Museum.
Right.
And we've got an office in Savoy, and we've got an office in Carterville down in Southern Illinois with a few staff, and an office in Northeastern Illinois. And we do a wide range of different geologic mapping and characterization activities related to, a big one right now is energy, but then we also do geologic mapping for water resources. Our Savoy offices deal almost exclusively with Illinois Department of Transportation. It's basically a research agency for applied research in support of state needs, state geologic priorities. Again, mostly characterizing the distribution, where these materials occur and what their characteristics are that are relevant to human activities, socioeconomic types of needs. We did a lot with coal, a lot with different mineral resources throughout the years, clays. It's been tied in at various times at different levels through the U of I. We're officially an affiliated agency with the university, so all of us are academic staff at the U of I. But we are also we are formally a state agency. So there's a nice collaborative relationship right now, and we take in soft money through. We work on contracts for different agencies, different local communities, the state, federal agencies sometimes. All of it focused within Illinois on Illinois problems.
And why would there be an association with the Department of Transportation?
That's a good question. There are two reasons in particular. Large road construction projects will have a tendency to do two different things. One is run into unanticipated infrastructure, basically. A lot of them would be old gasoline stations or that type of facility that might have buried tanks still that you couldn't see by doing a drive-by assessment.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a group of people in, again, the Savoy office and in the Northeastern Illinois office, I think primarily, who they really go out and they do what are called phase one assessments. We do some of that looking at old insurance maps through the university archives, go to the library. We look at old digital aerial photography and try and evaluate along these construction projects what the likelihood of unexpected occurrences would be, like underground tanks. They'll go out and they'll do some field work to evaluate whether they detect any leaking contamination that might be an issue that needs to be remediated. So the other aspect would be with wetlands.
Mm-hmm.
Road construction projects might need to go through an area with wetlands, and the regulations, federal and state regulations being what they are, they have to replace basically the wetland acreage. And so we have a group that is involved also with Illinois Department of Transportation to assist them in identifying locations and the suitability of different locations for constructed remediated wetlands.
And
So-
just why don't you expand on that a little bit so our viewers understand what you mean by replace the wetlands? How in the world can you replace a wetland?
Right, that's a good point. It's not impossible. It's not part of my center, so I don't want to misspeak too much. But basically, if we go in and put in a road and we disturb a 20-acre wetland site, then again we've lost 20 acres of wetland, which are a valuable part of the hydrologic cycle. And what we can do then is look for areas in the vicinity, I think typically, that might be suitable for construction of a wetlands. And so you can basically, what they're looking at is the water budget capabilities. Is it, if we create a basin of a certain size and shape, my assumption is, and again this is a little bit out of my
Right.
my group, but if we tie it into the rest of the surface water system in like ways, can we help create a wetland environment? Will the water flow and water budget of that site be compatible with the strict definitions of what a wetland can be? And there are pretty strict regulations or requirements as to what qualifies as a wetland. So you can tell pretty quickly within a couple of years, I think, if you've hit your target or not.
Well, that's good just to emphasize to people how important it is to replace, and you can't
Right.
just keep filling in wetlands
Right.
and filling them in
Right.
because there has to be the balance always
right.
maintained. Now, to your favorite topic, you're a hydrogeologist.
Right.
Didn't mean to
No, that's
deter
okay.
you too much, but I wanted to sort of build some foundation for our viewers. Just what is a hydrogeologist?
That's a good question. We've had discussions as to whether we should call ourselves that or not, because it can confuse people. The geology is a big field, a big discipline, the study of different earth processes, basically. So hydrogeologists focus on the hydro portions, basically the movement of water, the movement of things in the water, the reaction of water with the rock materials or earth materials that it moves through. A lot of my interests have focused on very shallow groundwater systems in Illinois, and the role that geologic materials and their variations play on how fast water can flow and how contamination that gets introduced to the system would migrate or survive, I guess, basically, if it gets broken down or not. Other hydrogeologists will look at aquifer characteristics. We're doing quite a bit now with a new initiative on water supply planning and management. So another aspect is to where are the aquifers? What is an aquifer geologically? How do we map it? And then within an aquifer specifically, how do the rock or earth material properties vary so that it would determine whether you can get more water or less water, or if the water flows faster or slower in different areas?
Well, you've opened up a lot of topics, but my first question is, my goodness, we have plenty of water.
Yes,
Here,
it seems that way, doesn't it?
Why in the world should we be concerned about that? Or maybe we in our area shouldn't be concerned, but other parts of the state and the country could be should be concerned.
Everybody thinks it's a humid environment. We get lots of rain. Why would we have to worry?
Yeah. Why in the world are we why are we having this conversation?
Yeah, we get a lot of our water from below the ground. It's not just stream water or lake water. And that groundwater, it takes a long time for the water to reach that. And so if we're taking it out at a rate that's faster than it's going in, if you just do a little simple math, you're going to see that eventually you're going to run into, potentially, you could run into deficit water supply problems. And the degree of those problems and the rate at which you reach them is going to be dependent on the size of the aquifer, the characteristics. In other words, how coarse is it? How much water does it support? How many other people have straws into that same aquifer and are drinking out of it? That's another big issue.
So how do we stand locally on the water, and then let's talk about what's happening in the rest of the state.
Yeah, locally we are tapping the Muhammad Aquifer, which is basically a sand and gravel deposit. As you probably know, the glaciers came and went through Illinois several times. Before they did, there was a big valley in the middle of the state, and it went from around Kankakee and it moves out to what used to be the ancient Mississippi over around Havana area.
Okay.
And
near water.
Exactly. Well, yes, and that filled up with sand and gravel, and so then it got covered by glaciers, kind of ran over it and covered it with clay and other sands. But we're taking our water out of that Muhammad aquifer, that sand in that bedrock aquifer. So it's a really nice source of water, really large, regionally extensive aquifer system. So it's doing well.
We're in good shape.
We are in pretty good shape, yeah.
Are there parts of the state that are in questionable shape?
Well, yes, to answer your question directly. What I was thinking of as you were saying that is
go ahead.
that in Champaign, we're in a valley, so it's possible. It's not something that we want to ignore. I guess that's all I want to say. We're not in a danger situation by any means of water supply. But my personal perspective is we all need to be a little bit more. We need to conserve just as a mentality. I really think, because if you I forget the statistic. The gallons of water that each of us Americans uses a day is astronomical, and it's not through always our house. It's food processing. It's plastics. It's our society. But again, I think it's just a water awareness isn't a bad perspective to have.
Well, go on with that, because that is important. We can talk
Yeah.
about the rest of the state. I won't forget that question. But what are some of the things then that we should be thinking about?
We're involved with Illinois American Water is our water company, and they are taking out, I think the number is around 20 million gallons a day for Champaign-Urbana distribution. There is this Mahomet Aquifer. There's also a set of sand deposits that's a little bit shallower above the Mahomet, at least at locations, that we get some of our water for Champaign-Urbana. There's talk of an ethanol plant nearby. Since you're looking at a narrow valley, sometimes if you're taking out enough water, the distribution of wells and the quantity that they're pumping, they can have an impact on each other. Even if it's not in a valley, if you put two high-capacity wells too close, they're going to basically kind of run into each other, if you will. The water level goes down as you pump. It can go back up when you stop pumping to a certain degree. But that drawdown, they call it, you draw the water levels down as you pump. If the wells are too close, they can basically interfere with each other. And I'm not saying that's not really happening. That's not a problem we're experiencing. But it's just, again, careful management of the resource is something that we need to be aware of, and we're doing a good job on that.
So you mentioned the ethanol plant.
Mm-hmm.
Possibility. Is that something from a planner's perspective then? Do we need to be thinking about what that ethanol plant would be drawing in the way of water?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big user. It's talking about potentially taking, I think, 10%, equivalent of 10% of Champaign-Urbana's total daily pumpage, 2 million gallons a day. They were talking on that order. And so when you're talking about high-capacity wells, it's not a bad thing to just think about the impacts locally. And it doesn't really matter if it's 2 million, it could be 200,000. You just, again, I think if there are local wells in the area, how are the local wells going to interact with this system? It's just a prudent planning perspective to take. And it's sometimes, it's below the ground. We don't usually see it, we don't interact, and
just
out of sight, out of mind is the way it goes.
Out of sight, out of mind, not to lose any further thoughts on this, but out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
There was a wonderful from the sense of the result of it, experiment that was done in the Netherlands.
Okay.
And the Netherlands is a country that, if we rank usage of water, is really down on the lower end, as you well know.
Per capita,
but for our viewers, they tend to be quite cautious in their use of water. And their equivalent of our water company put the water meters in the front hallway in the homes.
Yeah.
Where it's visible.
You walk by it all the time.
You walk by it, you see
Sure.
you see the usage going on. And for a country that already had very low usage, they even
It brought it down.
It brought it down.
Huh, yeah.
So it tells us that if we are visually seeing these things, that it brings it to our our attention. And so maybe there are some clever ways that we could be doing some of these things in an educational format, so people really have a more visual aspect of how much water we are using, but we're not registering it, and we're not thinking about it because it isn't in a container and it's sort of running down the street as we water our lawn or something like that.
Right. It's an awareness. It's difficult, though. It's not a real trivial thing. There are some resources out there that you can take advantage of. So I think putting yourself kind of in the way of having to find things out isn't a bad thing. You know, there's always things they talk about when you're washing dishes. Think of how we use water and where that's going. That's a first step. How do you use water your lawn? Can you work that a little bit better? You know, there's a lot of different aspects to it.
So what have you put into your own lifestyle that you could share with our viewers that they can think about?
What did I put into my own lifestyle? You know, I don't know.
Do
I've
you have
changed
showers that automatically turn off
You
after
know,
a few
that's
seconds?
yeah. We have a shower head that you can turn down so that it
But
comes
not like
out
the
trickle.
Germans where you have to keep.
I've seen my sister moved to Phoenix, and she's got a really ingenious set of handle sets where you can actually spin it, and it turns the shower completely off, and you spin it back on to the same temperature. Again, the shower head we've got is similar, and you can dial it down to kind of let it go trickle while you're doing that.
Right.
That kind of thing. Low flow. We put a new toilet in. Low flow toilets. Washing dishes, that's one thing I get kind of goofy on. Just how you set that, you know, you could kind of optimize those to death, right? But just, I think awareness is the big deal, and just figuring out where that it does matter on some level, I think, and not overreacting. Our situation is markedly different than Northeastern Illinois, as an example.
Okay, let's talk about Northeastern Illinois. What's happening up there?
There's a lot of growth. I mean, it's some of the fastest growth, you know, at least per county. In the country is going on in Northeastern Illinois, and we're taking as much water pretty much as we can get out of Lake Michigan legally. So our limits on that resource are.
Why don't you explain what you mean by there's only so much that can be
Right.
taken out of?
There's basically the shorthand is there's an international treaty which sets limits as to how much different the states can take out of the Great Lakes, and not just Lake Michigan. And we have, I think, at times exceeded our limit, and I think we're doing pretty good right now. The city of Chicago has done a lot for water conservation over the last decade, has dropped a lot of their usage down dramatically. But basically, we've extended what they call out of basin, I think, water usage, which is the watershed concept, which a lot of people are familiar, which is basically the land area that contributes to a specific surface water body, be it a stream or a lake. Well, the land area in Illinois where the runoff goes back into Lake Michigan is amazingly small. It's 10 miles. It's not just 10. It's a very small, narrow band around Lake Michigan. And so a lot of the communities that are pumping water out of the lake are actually outside of the watershed. You know, I think there's certain limits within the treaty that allow for that. We're in compliance, is my understanding right now, but the bottom line is additional growth is not going to be able to generally come. If they're not on lake water, they're not going to really go on to lake water. They've got to find other resources, and that would be then other surface water or groundwater.
That's something, again, because we aren't seeing this water, most people aren't thinking about this in relationship to population growth. Probably the most extreme example right now is what's happening in Las Vegas and Henderson. And
it's most obvious, I guess, at least, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what they're drawing out of the Colorado River,
Right.
and how much unbalance that is causing in relationship to what's getting to California
Yeah,
and these situations. But oftentimes that's not part of the kind of
the equation.
The equation.
Yeah, right. It isn't, and they're, I think, running into situations where they're drawing out of sand deposits that aren't what we call lithified. They're not rocks yet. They're still loose enough so that when they pull the water out, the water is actually supporting some of the structure, and so the load above the aquifer that they're using basically presses down, and as it draws water out, it collapses a little bit, and that's volume of aquifer that they're losing effectively. So even if they slow their usage down, they're not going to be able to get the same capacity as easily as they might have had they either pumped a little bit more efficiently or a little bit less, possibly.
Right, or
you know, a little bit more appropriate water usage. Yeah, it's a difficult balance.
It is a difficult balance, and
I was just reminding me I was at a conference, and one of the things that was said there that I think is really important for everyone to realize, and it was kind of irritating, I think, to the research community, was that this concept of water sustainability is not really a technical question. And we tend to, as researchers, think of it, well, what's the level of pumpage that I can get to keep this watershed, this flow system happy, as it were? Well, that happy is all relative. If the community decides that the wetlands and the surface water low flow conditions are not critical to their societal picture, you can pull more water out of the system, and it's not going to upset you that you dry up some wetlands. If these are issues that you want, then there's a different, basically, economic that you can work with, and that's something that I think we put in the back of our minds and delegate to a small number of people, and it's an enormous responsibility. What it does is it shifts the burden of responsibility. Then when I use water, I don't have to worry about it, and it's really a societal. It's increasingly a societal decision.
So the intersection between your work and planning is
it's
really
racing together real quickly.
It is very, very important to underline why
Right,
it's important, why it's so helpful to have this conversation with you. Well, when you talk about wetlands, I think about what's happening in Florida.
Yeah.
Again, that's outside our state and
Yeah.
the domain of our conversation, but Florida is covering up their wetlands so quickly that they've created for themselves many other
Right.
environmental problems that.
There was a book I referred to you about. There's a book. There's some anecdotes that I was reading in this book that talk about a subdivision going on in and around a nice lake in Florida, and their system is all karst, which means it's this limestone where the water comes from cracks, and then the crack dissolves some of the rocks and makes little caves, and the lakes are actually connected to this. So the local houses went in and started pulling all the water out. Well, they woke up one morning and their lake had disappeared, and their solution was to fill the hole in and then pump in from the groundwater. And they didn't get that it was just this, and it was just again this folly of what's happening. What are we doing? And we just don't understand. So I think what they ended up actually doing is putting a liner of material in it, filling it up with water again from the groundwater, and pretending it's
a fake
trying
lake.
to make an isolated system. It'll probably be successful to some degree, but it just again it puts out of our mind the reality of what we're doing sometimes.
Oh, you just slipped into talking about the book, but why don't you mention the title of it?
Yeah, okay.
Don and I were, before the taping started, talking about any books that he might recommend for the viewers to pick up and read to get a further understanding of the importance of water. So please talk about that.
It's a book called Water Follies, and it's by a lawyer actually looking at water law issues in the U.S. and water supply situations. And Robert Glennon is his name, and he's out of, I think, the University of Arizona, Tucson. And again, it's I've started it. Again, I mentioned I was going to finish it on my upcoming vacation. So it's really a fascinating look at some of the issues. It touches on the bottled water issue quite strongly. And one of the other things that I've picked up from that needs to be, I think, in our front mind is that we seem to have a tendency to like spring water versus drinking water. And spring water has a regulatory kind of a permitting a rule that says, well, you can't call yourself spring water unless you're within a certain distance from a spring. That has a strong possibility of eliminating that spring by putting that water in. And it doesn't change the quality of the water at all as if I went a half a mile away. It's the same unit. Well, I could kill, and this has happened in several places around the world, by pumping that aquifer right near the spring. Again, it's this drawdown around the well that can happen. It can eliminate the discharge from a spring, which may be a major part of the stream ecosystem. And Nestle, which is one of the biggest mega bottled water companies, got into some problems in Wisconsin that they mentioned, where they were basically talking about possibly drying up a spring that fed a major trout stream. So it's happening all over the world, whereas if you just went and said, specifically I want non-spring drinking water, if I'm going to drink that, that's something that's a really prudent choice potentially.
Yes, and for our country where water quality really basically is not an issue, because as an urban planner, then we need to take the bottled water one more step, and that has to do with the container.
Right. Oh, that's exactly right.
For the bottled water and what amount of energy it takes to produce huge amount of energy, petroleum energy. And then we go to the next step, and that is, in fact, I visited the recycling center at the university and looked at the compacted plastic that had been pulled out of the trash at the university, and there were yards and yards and bales and bales of plastic, and most of that plastic was bottles from, and that means landfill, and what happens to that next, and so
it's I think it gets overwhelming for people. It just gets overwhelming at a point. But it's a very easy thing. We do drink bottled water at our house, but we tend to keep the bottles and refill them. And again, there's more regulations on your tap than there probably is on the bottled water, depending on where you are. That's something I've heard. I don't know if the laws have changed that in the recent past, but my understanding was that the permitting regulations are more lax on bottled water facilities. Drinking water from municipal water supplies in the U.S. is really generally very good.
It's generally very good, and there's some new literature out this is a
Way
little bit
off
off the
track, yeah.
track, but there's new literature out on the concern of the leaching of the chemicals from the plastic
Yeah.
of the
Oh, yeah,
bot-
right.
bottled water, and so reusing those and
I got something in the internet, on the email about that, and I chased it down. Part of that was just folklore,
legend.
urban legend. Yeah. So there is some concern with some of these, but I think again, I think that the permitting, I think the FDA, is probably got a pretty good regulations on that. I never got, from the looking I did, there wasn't really a significant risk at all from the bottles, even though that the email suggested there was.
Right.
You know, they were also talking about saran wrap in a similar email, and you know, it's not as bad as that kind of a thing makes out. So check those things out more clearly.
Get away from the urban legends.
Yeah, it's very they're problematic. I get people sending me those every once in a while. It's just
Well, let me take you back to the issue of the quality of our water. And
Mhm.
you and some of your colleagues worked on a paper
Right.
concerning runoff
Right.
and what it does to the quality of water. And again, that's something that we do read about,
hmm
but it's not quite in our backyard, quote
Yeah,
unquote,
right,
so we
right.
don't think about it a lot.
Mhm.
What's happening and what should we
You're
be
talking agricultural runoff.
agricultural
row crop.
runoff or any of the other runoffs
Mhm.
that do contaminate our groundwater?
Yeah, we at the State Geological Survey with the Illinois State Water Survey, we've done a lot of research over the last 20 years looking at water quality impacts of primarily farming practices, row crop agricultural types of things. The main ones that you get in water are nitrogen and pesticides, herbicides and insecticides. Almost all of them are herbicides. The insecticide chemical properties are such that they tend to bind very quickly to the soil, and
They don't run off.
they really don't. Well, they don't leach. Now,
Leach.
runoff, depending on which way you're talking, downward leaching is typically the word we use. Runoff tends to be into the surface water systems. If you do absorb or stick to the soil, and that soil does run off, then soil
Okay.
erosion is still an issue.
It's good to have that clarification.
Yes, and I don't think that's still the problem that it has been in the distant past, or intermediate past. And we have found that some of the chemicals do leach, and some of them can leach to a level that are getting the attention of the U.S. EPA. And if you use that as a metric of whether it should get public attention, that would suggest that it's worth looking at and keeping an eye on. I've seen some literature from some groups, public interest groups, that I think really exaggerated the problem or misrepresented the problem even at times. And it's a bit confusing, to be very honest. If you're on a municipal water supply, even if it's taking it out of a lake, the point of withdrawal isn't where you need to worry about it from a health perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The point of withdrawal may be where you want to worry about it from an environmental perspective. Those are different perspectives, and the EPA is going to be most concerned with what you're ingesting. The laws for ingestion are pretty strict. In other words, the limits are low. A lot of the reports, several of the reports I saw, were actually not really being that clear, but they were taking out a point of, the point at the pump, but not at the pump, but basically where the pipe went in the lake, that's where they were taking it
okay.
before any treatment. So
Okay.
the treatment really will strip a lot of that out oftentimes very easily. It's still something to be aware of, and there are communities with problems, nitrate problems specifically. Nitrate's not as easy to rip out of the water. Surface water systems, surface water supply systems in Illinois tend to be more of an issue than groundwater for that. We looked at a lot of domestic wells, and there really was a significant amount, I guess you could say, of domestic well, private water supply well owners. If I had a private well, I'd be aware of what was in it. And honestly, that you can send samples to the State Water Survey or your public health department, but they're going to do what they call inorganic chemicals. Depending on where you live, it's not bad to even look. You may have to find somebody else and pay a couple $100s for a sample to be run to look at other chemicals if that's a concern to you. If you live in the middle of a farming community and your well is shallow, that's something to be aware of. Good construction practices for your well tend to alleviate a lot of problems, but not all of them.
And what about other runoffs? Runoffs off our streets. And,
Yeah.
And
That's
blacktop surfaces where everything just.
You can see the sheen kind of go down the storm sewer, can't you? Yeah. That's
Yes.
Yeah, that's more of a surface water issue because those go into our storm sewers typically, and that's again I tend to look at the groundwater. That is
They don't ever commingle.
Well, no, that's not true at all. They do. That you're baiting me. I thank you. They do. It's a connected cycle. You're right. But at the same time, usually what you see when you take a pipe and you bury it in the ground and you run the water through it, most of the water is staying in that pipe. Realistically, those are not designed to be leak-proof. That's not a big worry.
Okay.
So where they discharge, the point at which they discharge can run into water quality problems,
Okay.
depending on the quantity and the amount of urbanization and where it's draining. That's again, that's not an issue that I'm really not familiar enough with
Okay.
water quality problems. I don't think it's a non-issue, but it's again not the issue it used to be. We used to have a lot of, not just houses, we used to have a lot of businesses that would tie their sewers, their floor drains into storm sewers, and so you'd be getting a lot of, and a lot of times even septic into storm sewers, and so you'd be getting really bad things into that system and into your streams and lakes, and that's really been regulated away. And
I was going to say.
with
yeah.
increasing attention and development, when you get something that breaks, you call in a plumber. They've got to follow code. We're eliminating those
problems.
Yeah, and I don't. That's really not the problem it used to be, and that's. When it comes to groundwater, one of the things that we deal with increasingly with planners, if you will, and again, how geology relates is the surface water groundwater connection. A lot of low flow conditions, if you will, and except immediately after the storm, where you
Why
can.
don't you explain low flow
Yeah.
conditions?
The stream flow is going to change over a given year based on rainfall or meltwater from snow, and so immediately after, you'll get runoff that you can see occurring during these events, if you will, rainfall events or meltwater events. After a period of time, well, after that event, really the rest of the water is coming through the subsurface at varying distances, and the longer you get from these rainfall or runoff producing events, the more you're really probably isolating a flow. The flow from your stream is related to exclusively what we call groundwater base flow conditions. And so if you're in an environment where you have a lot of surface water bodies, Northeastern Illinois has a lot of variability. In Lake County, for example, they do have a lot of wetlands, a lot of lakes, and so there's a lot more instances where this shallow groundwater to surface water interaction comes into place. That shallow groundwater comes from infiltration, rain and snow melting and infiltrating the ground surface. If we pave that ground surface, the rain doesn't get in, or a very small fraction of the rain and snow gets in. And so one of the things we're involved with is trying to use geologic maps to identify areas where zoners and communities might want to do a different kind of planning, where we say, well, look at this area in your community is particularly vulnerable to the surface water groundwater interactions. And so if you're going to be creating impervious surfaces, roads and
Right.
whatever, you might want to give that
Why don't
special
you
attention.
Explain what impervious surface
An
is.
impervious surface could be a paved road, it could be a sidewalk, a driveway. Your roof is pretty impervious if it works well. And all of those areas, that land surface that it occupies, then the rain doesn't usually infiltrate that same footprint. And it's that distribution of, it's the evenness or the distribution of rainfall infiltrating the system that kind of define the whole hydrologic cycle as we know it today. It can change again based on the community needs, and usually the community values growth almost above all things, right? So how do we grow, and how does that growth impact other aspects of our life? And that's where, again, the water cycle and the geology can come into play. Unfortunately, it can come into play if you don't pay attention after the fact, and the costs can be extremely high. And so what we're trying to do at the survey is participate with the growth, the communities in the growth, identify areas where these issues might be relevant, provide them with information, geologic maps and the like, that could help guide decisions that they would make on these judgments of where the community is going to grow and how.
So if these communities were using pervious surfaces, in
Mhm.
other words,
Yeah.
surfaces where the water could slowly percolate down, does this help minimize some of these issues that you were talking about?
It should. I mean, to answer it, I'll kind of dodge that a little bit. It should, because you're putting that water, letting it go back in. It depends where the permeable or pervious surfaces are. And how that, what kind of volume a detention basin might be seen as a localized sort of recharge basin, where we take the runoff and shoot it into a detention basin, and it fills up to a level and slowly infiltrates, and that's going to be this into the ground surface. Some of them are just sort of a retention, and then they store a certain amount, and then it just kind of delays the travel time to the storm sewer and out into the stream.
So for our viewers, all those ponds that we see up on North
Yeah.
Prospect, are they detention or are they retention?
I'm not even going to comment on that.
Okay.
I think there's probably an aspect. I think there's an aspect of both in there. I think there's
Okay.
a certain minimum capacity, and then when it overtops, it's going to go through the pipes. You can see some of the pipes out there.
You can see some of
So
the
I'm pretty
French
sure
drains
that's
there.
what those are.
Okay.
Some of the things we do see, we were at a hole in some of the development that was made for a pond in some of the development in Western Champaign.
Okay.
And it was actually in the newspaper recently in Champaign-Urbana. And it was interesting because it was out in front of these moraines that we have in Illinois, and there were some interesting sand deposits. And the ponds there were quickly filled in after we left, and they turned the pumps off. It quickly filled in because the sands there were just contributing water really quickly. And so depending on the geology, you can have a level of water in there that may be higher than you like.
And how could they have avoided that happening if they had checked with you all
Well,
first?
that can happen. At some point, there's a cost benefit to some of these things.
Okay.
One of the difficulties can be in that environment. It's not a real problem. They can construct the pond, I think, so it runs off properly, or it might just be convenient that it holds the water level at a more, uniform level throughout the year.
Rather up and down. And
Yeah,
up and down.
than
Right.
dynamic. One of the issues that brought out in that area was development and the consequences of homes. And so whether or not a developer chooses to purchase a plot for development, if they're thinking about it, they might explore. And I think the developer who purchased land, one of them that I'm thinking of, he knew the sand was there, and my understanding is that he's taking he's got that in mind for the construction development that he has. That came into effect in the Healy Street Basin several years ago, where there wasn't any drilling done, I don't think, beforehand. There were a bunch of us from the survey out kind of climbing over that thing, and there were some nice sands in the north end of that really provided a lot of water, and they ended up having to line it. And again, there's things that you have to do. They're not really hard to work around. You can pump these things out to keep their capacity open. And that, again, what you're trying to do is take a bunch of water out of the system in a short term and then feed it back in slowly. So if you have to pump the thing because it's filling slowly, that's really not a net problem from a water management perspective, really. It's really a easy to do kind of a thing. So that wasn't a big deal. Really where it comes in is it going to cause a problem, a design change,
Like at Prospect and Daniel, when there was so much water running
Yeah.
down and they had to go in and redesign it. But this is something that, from the planning perspective,
Yeah.
that we do need to be thinking about because we are covering land, which is
Mhm.
a permeable surface.
Yeah, right.
And so if it can't go down, it runs somewhere,
Right.
and it runs, liquid runs downhill, and
Yeah, right. Basically.
then it collects.
Yeah. Then it'll collect, yeah. And that could be a bad thing.
There would be.
Right.
You brought a lot of maps with you. Are there some aspects of our conversation that you want to?
Sure. One of the things the survey, the State Geological Survey, has been involved with geologic mapping, obviously, for 100 years, as we talked about. For the last a little over 30 years, we've been doing geologic mapping of these shallow deposits, specifically with an eye towards community planning and development. And a lot of the publications, I have a couple here that are more historic.
We can just hold them up.
Yeah, these I don't have to put up. This one was done for the Decatur and Springfield area. And this was done in 1976, and this other one is from McHenry County, which is a much more recent effort. And these are what we call geology for planning or environmental planning.
And can the general public access these?
Yes, they can. Some of them may be out of print at this point, but the ones that are not out of print, they can order. We've now, the last year I think it was, converted all of our publications to print on demand, and so you can get things. This is older than that, but in the future you'll be able to get these things digitally on CDs or PDFs as well.
And I always like to remind everybody, as residents of the state of Illinois, they have access to the university library,
Yes.
and so all of these documents.
These are all in the library, and the State Geological Survey.
These documents would be in the library, so
correct.
That would be easy for people to get a hold of them.
Another thing if we want to go to the map here, I brought, this is just one example of some mapping that we're doing in Lake County, Illinois. This is just what I'm trying to do, just to show you here. Let me play with this a little bit. I'll zoom in, is to show you the kind of detail that we have. This is called a quadrangle map. And I'm trying to focus here for us. It basically is one of the platforms that we map geology on. Oops.
That wasn't you.
Okay. That we map the geology on. There you go. And you can basically see the Des Plaines River flowing through the center of this
Why
map.
did you point to
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
Where are we? This is the Des Plaines River flowing through here. We've got some quarries in the sand and gravel, and then these are basically some glacial till deposits, if you will. And this gives you an idea of the level of detail of the mapping information. This is actually part of actual 3D mapping that we're doing down potentially a couple hundred feet. Basically mapping the glacial deposits, which can be, again, a couple hundred feet, depending on where you are, throughout Lake County.
Tell people why this is so important.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was getting to. It's this is information that you can use if you're trying to figure out, well, I've got the potential to site a facility here or a facility here. If that facility is likely to have chemicals that might be of contaminants and quantities that might be of a concern, you might want to put it on an area where any leaks wouldn't be as much of an environmental problem for cleanup. This yellow in this river valley is going to be sand and gravel associated with it. Those aren't going to be, that's not where you're going to be getting a lot of drinking water supplies removed locally, but it could be a situation where the local water flow takes it back into the Des Plaines River, and it could be more of a systemic problem that way. You know, what we're doing is trying to get an understanding of the distribution of these materials. When we're out there, we're also looking at the characteristics of the materials. How coarse is the sand? Does the coarseness from these river channels, does it go in a certain direction? That means if a contaminant gets introduced, it's going to move that way preferentially. How do we know if water is being pumped? It's going to be pumped preferentially through that. It's just understanding, again, more of the system so that we can make recommendations to someone who would be using that or living on that and interacting with that. Well, what do you expect? We've done some work with the quarries up in that area. This is Lake County again, showing them what's going on in the geology, giving them some insight possibly.
I was just going to ask you if you were sharing this with the planners up in that area.
And these are actually the quarry operators who let us on their site. We're mapping within their site. Then we go back and show them what information we found and how that might relate to their quarry development.
Actually, what is so terribly interesting about this in relationship to planning decisions is when you have this information along with other information that we generally use in making planning decisions, it really starts shaping where places can go and makes the decision-making process much cleaner.
Yeah, it does, and that's our goal. Let me show you some more images if I can down here. This is, again, some pictures that were some maps that we're making. These are the kind of technologies that we have these days that we didn't used to, the way the computers are impacting the geology. What that turns around, we can give the county an image like this, a data set that this is generated that they can use. This shows the map, that map maybe we just looked at and draped over the same model. And here is the elevation and a photograph draped over. It gives you a lot more hands-on information on what's going on. What we used to do is just strictly these cross sections. Now we're building a full three-dimensional model of the geology. This Lake County mapping is being done in part with state money, in part with actually money from the federal government. It's part of this Central Great Lakes Geologic Mapping Coalition, and the Illinois Geologic Survey is a member of that, and we get money through the federal government to the USGS and then back down to the states to do detailed mapping. Primarily, the recognition these days is for water supply, protection, identification.
And how do you decide what areas of the state you choose to map, or are you just very systematically going to map the whole state?
Well, the impacts are going to be economic, public health, environmental health. Those are really our drivers as a government agency. Those are the things we're looking at. Northeastern Illinois that we talked about is a major part of the economy of this state. Drives the economy of the state. They're going, like I said, they're running into some groundwater shortages up there. We prioritize Lake County, which is the northeastmost county in Illinois, as our first detailed 3D mapping location
So
for
it was
this
your
mapping
pilot
coalition.
for this.
Effectively, that's how we're starting this coalition effort off. And we've got several quads that we're working through. These areas are called quadrangles. They're portions of the map of the area. And I think in the next 3 to 4 years, we should be finishing up pretty much all of the county with a full 3D map of these glacial deposits and how they're distributed. We're also generating maps of the bedrock occurrence and distribution. We're taking these, if we can go back to this again, sorry about bouncing you all over the place. If we can, this is what we call, this is an aquifer, let me zoom out, I'm sorry. This is an aquifer sensitivity map for McHenry County, Illinois, and it basically shows just the geology that we've seen. It's been interpreted into these kind of bright stoplight colors, and what we've done is and the legend over here that no one can, not to read, but just to give you a feel, the products give you recommendations on what these mean. This means that there's basically a moderately high potential, this orange, for aquifer contamination by near surface activities. And this map specifically is being used by McHenry County Planning.
There.
You don't put, yeah, exactly. You're very careful in how you zone.
Right.
You can't help it if there's a facility there already. You can be aware of the possibility for aquifer contamination if it exists. It really helps people prioritize their distribution
resources.
resources.
With that business to move someplace else.
Exactly.
Help them move.
And McHenry County, this was one of the last ones we did. This report was one of the last ones we did that was sort of the old technology, and they've come back even and mentioned that they'd be interested in having us go back and revisit it.
With one of the 3D?
Yeah, with more detailed 3D, which would be a tool that they could use. And again, it's got a little bit more, we have slice maps right now of their materials, and those are useful. And we have these compilation interpretive maps, and those are also very helpful. What we're trying to get a feel for with the technology changing is just to understand how the planners and communities really, what information do they really need or want, and how are they going to use that, what kind of interaction and assistance are they going to need. We're here as an agency, we're not just throwing these things out and walking away. We're here to also basically service the product that we're providing. And so what I'm trying to do these days is get in discussions with planners specifically to say, well, they said that they wanted this. Well, what do they mean? Because sometimes there's a perception of what they're getting in a product, a map, what it can really show them, and that perception may be wrong. If they're wrong on that, I'd like to talk to them a little bit, kind of teach them really what it can do and see then, well, do we tweak that a little bit to cover these needs? In Lake County, for example, we're talking to them about doing some maps that look at the potential for surface water, groundwater interaction from a zoning perspective that deal with this impervious surface issue. And then areas where we look at potential for aquifer recharge or water reaching to the aquifer, and so that becomes a water quality and sustainability issue. Those really can be the same interpretation potentially, but we might put them out as two different maps so that the planner it's a little bit easier to use in this. Oh, well, you're in the zone that says, well, you're really close to a surface water body. We're going with the zoning program that says a limit of 30% or 70% impervious surfaces, and this, that's a zoning decision. That's not a decision we get involved with.
And to make this really real for our viewers, again, another state, but groundwater issues are very important in Texas.
Yeah, right.
And Austin, Texas has ordinances on how you can cover surfaces and how much can run off. And
well, there are communities, I think, in Illinois. I think Long Grove is a pretty progressive example.
Oh, okay.
They've been doing some neat things with that and really trying to reach out. And I'm sure there are others. One of the things that I can share, I'll make it anonymous, but it illustrates the scope of the problem. We were at a meeting in Northeastern Illinois, and one of the water managers, we were talking about the possibility of conservation as an issue. Should the developers be looking at that? And my comment was, why would you not, knowing that, again, in Northeastern Illinois, we just have this development that we're having a real water management problem. How do we manage it efficiently and effectively for the long term? Because we're running into short-term problems. Basically, the water manager said, well, there's a policy out in our city that we don't have any water problems. We don't have any water conservation needs, and so we're not allowed to talk about it. And that level of education needs to be addressed. They felt it was a competitive disadvantage for their community to say that they had a water problem.
Okay.
And so that wouldn't bring in a business. And so they were going to say there wasn't a water problem. Well, that's again, that's part of this thing we need to educate people towards.
Well, and also it isn't just one community. It is a regional aspect.
It is.
Water.
It is.
Water doesn't know boundaries.
It doesn't know boundaries. It completely.
It goes beyond that, and that is probably part of a lot of the outreach that you do at the survey. And,
Right.
And I know you have the survey webpage up here, so
Yeah,
maybe we
show you
can
that
take
briefly.
a moment and show that.
Didn't show up. Basically, let me list our URL. We've got
Yes,
it on the
let's do that.
website here. It's www.isgs.uiuc.edu.
We can't seem to bring it up.
So basically, ISG is for Illinois State Geological Survey, UIUC is the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and EDU is the education again for the university. We're again, as an affiliate agency, we're part of the U of I's network and domain.
Well, we can't do it as beautifully as if the webpage, but if you put that on the Elmo, I did
Thank you.
print out the webpage, and that will help our viewing audience.
That's what you'll get at that. Let me see if the URL
And
shows up.
that opens the door for people of the community and the state to access not only to Don Keefer's section on hydrogeology,
Correct.
but the other sections that make up the geological
Right.
survey and a lot of the mapping, a lot of the educational materials.
We do. We've got an enormous amount of information online. We've got information if you want to look at your water well or what the water wells of your neighbors look like. We've got our water well records online through our online, our online wells and data. We've got a lot of maps that you can actually download to your computer, PDFs.
Right.
You can order things from us. There's information on ordering. You can order it. We're getting our e-commerce site up and running in the near future, so that's not as smooth as that's going to be in the very near future. But again, we've got contact information and a lot of pubs that are really available. We don't make money off of them. We make distribution costs back off, so
Right.
they're really well priced.
That's part of your educational arm
It really is.
and your mission.
It is.
At the
Extension, really, and
at
we
the
do,
survey.
all of us do a certain amount of information providing back to the public. That's why we're here, is to provide that information resource, our expertise. I've been telling people lately, they can get anybody to manage the data, but they really need people with the expertise to really help decide what the relevance of that data is, what makes sense, why do we care, as you started out with.
As we close our conversation, I do want to underline what you said just a few moments ago, and that is having the conversation with the decision makers in the community so they understand what kind of information they can gain from the different forms of data and mapping that can be done, and that's a very helpful conversation.
I was just at a recent forum in Grundy County, we talked about earlier before we went on, and they basically their growth is astronomical, and so they were asking us to come in and provide some insight, and that was what our role there was a public forum to say, hey, these are the resources you have, this is what we can help you do with them.
Well, our conversation with Don Keefer this afternoon certainly opens the door for everybody to know more about the Illinois State Geological Survey and the importance of thinking about what's underneath that black top or gray top.
Or grass even, yes.
Surface. Thank you for joining us on Community Planning Conversations, and remember, planning matters.